One afternoon in mid-July 2014, 59-year-old Jack Parks and his fiancée, Carol LaPaya, walked through their neighborhood of Kennedy Township, Pennsylvania. Jack sported a black fedora, wireframe glasses, and a lopsided grin beneath a graying mustache. Carol hung on his arm, smiling at how her engagement ring sparkled in the sunlight. As they walked, they passed by several neighbors who were outside doing yard work or talking. Jack and Carol waved to each person as they passed, and everyone waved back. Their neighborhood was a close-knit, working-class community 10 miles outside of Pittsburgh, and everybody seemed to know each other. In fact, Jack even had family on this street. One of his nephews, Bradley Johnson, lived nearby. As Jack and Carol passed by Bradley's house, Jack slowed down, trying to see if Bradley was home. His nephew had mentioned wanting to talk to him in person about something serious and urgent, but Jack could see that the house was empty, so that conversation would have to wait. Which was fine, because today, Jack and Carol were on a mission. Inside of Carol's purse was a large stack of wedding invitations, and they were on their way to drop these invitations in the mail, which was huge for them, because their wedding had been an unusually long time coming. So Jack and Carol had met at a bar 25 years ago. They'd fallen for each other quickly, but Jack had dragged his feet on proposing. And then, when he had felt ready, Carol was swamped at work. Then Jack was busy. The timing was just always bad. And the longer they put marriage off, the less important it seemed. And anyways, they were in love and totally committed to each other. They didn't need a marriage license to prove that. But last February, Jack's mother had passed away. Her death had made him realize that he wasn't getting any younger, and he really wanted to marry the woman he'd loved for decades. So, a few months ago, he'd finally proposed. And ever since, their days had been consumed with wedding preparations. They had the venue, the dress, and the rings, and now it was finally time to send out the invitations. The couple came to the end of the block and stopped in front of the mailbox. Carol took the envelopes from her purse and then joked that this was their last chance to cross anyone off their invite list. Jack just laughed and said they were not cutting anyone. So Carol pushed the envelopes through the mailbox slot until only one invitation remained. Carol hesitated for a second, looking at the name on that last envelope. It was her nephew, a 22-year-old named Michael LaPaya. She and Jack had been angry at Michael this whole past year. Their broken relationship with him was a sore spot for both of them. So Jack and Carol did not have children of their own, but they'd always doted on their nieces and nephews. When the kids were younger, Jack and Carol would have them over for slumber parties where they'd stay up late watching movies and eating popcorn, and as the kids got older, they'd all stayed close, except for Michael. A few years back, Michael had started drifting away from Jack and Carol and the rest of the family, and getting into lots of trouble. He joined the army, but gotten dishonorably discharged for marijuana possession, and ever since, he'd suffered from PTSD and began experimenting with harder drugs. But that was actually not what caused the rift. Jack and Carol had supported Michael, even through his struggles, until one day the previous September. During a Labor Day party that Jack and Carol had hosted, guests had seen Michael go into the couple's bedroom. And when the party was over, Carol had discovered that her expensive jewelry was missing. Jack and Carol had confronted Michael, who denied taking anything, but they hadn't believed him. They told him he was no longer welcome in their home, and things had been extremely tense between them ever since. But now, Jack and Carol were ready to make amends by inviting Michael to their wedding. So, standing on the sidewalk, Carol took a deep breath and then dropped Michael's invitation into the mailbox. And suddenly, both Jack and Carol felt a whole lot lighter. The invitations were out, and good things were ahead. Jack and Carol turned away from the mailbox and began heading back home. As they reached their driveway, Jack waved to a few men standing directly across the street, outside of a small factory called Silver Star Meats. The workers were outside in their aprons smoking, and they waved back. Jack was about to go over and talk to them when he noticed Carol's irritated expression, and so he thought better of it. Jack liked the guys from the factory, but he knew they made Carol uncomfortable. She hated that they took their smoke breaks so close to their house, and she thought their blood-stained aprons were kind of unsettling. So Jack just turned away, and then he and Carol walked up their porch steps and into their house. A few days later, on Monday, July 21st, Carol sat at her desk at work, reviewing her to-do list for the wedding. The ceremony was just 6 weeks away, and there was still a lot to figure out. But then, at 10:45 a.m., her cell phone rang. And to her surprise, it was Jack's realtor. Jack had hired this realtor to sell his mother's house after she had died, and now the realtor said some potential buyers wanted to see the house that afternoon. She wanted Jack and Carol to meet her there at 4 p.m. This was all good news, because Carol and Jack had been eager to sell that house as quickly as possible. But before hanging up, Carol asked why the realtor called her instead of calling Jack. The realtor said they did call Jack first. He just didn't answer. This seemed odd to Carol. As soon as she hung up, she tried Jack's cell phone, and it rang several times before going to voicemail. She left him a message, then hung up and called the house. And as it rang, she expected to hear Jack's voice any second, but again, the call went to voicemail. Carol just sat there, trying to ignore the sick feeling of dread in her stomach. Jack knew what a worrier she could be, so he always answered her calls. But she told herself that maybe he was in the shower, or maybe outside mowing the grass without his phone on him. He would probably call her back any minute. But the clock kept ticking, and by noon, Jack still had not called. And so Carol tried him again, but he still didn't answer. Frustrated, she dropped her phone back in her purse and just focused on her computer, trying to ignore her mounting anxiety. But by 2:30 p.m., when still Jack had not called, so now it's been 3.5 hours since that first missed call, Carol just couldn't take it anymore. So she left work and began heading straight home. 20 minutes later, Carol pulled up outside of her and Jack's house. And right away, she saw that the garage door was open and Jack's car was inside, which meant he had to be home. Carol felt relieved. She was sure Jack would explain why he had missed her calls, and better yet, they'd still be able to make their 4 p.m. appointment with their realtor. But as Carol got out of her car and started up the walkway, she saw something that made her stomach drop all over again. So Jack and Carol's front porch was enclosed by a gate, and both Jack and Carol always kept the gate closed because their dog was a runner, and they wanted to make sure he didn't get out. But now Carol saw the gate was wide open. Carol rushed through the gate to the front door and turned the knob. But even though the doorknob turned, meaning it was unlocked, the door didn't budge when she pushed on it. That's when Carol realized the deadbolt inside, which they never used, must be locked. And now her anxiety turned to actual fear. Between the deadbolt, the open gate, and Jack not answering his phone, she was certain something had to be wrong here. Carol's hands shook as she dug through her purse for the house key, then struggled to get it into the lock. Finally she did, the deadbolt turned, and the door swung open. Carol stepped inside with her heart pounding, but the house was silent and still. She took a few steps further in, and then her eyes suddenly fell on something under the coffee table inside of the living room. For a second, her brain couldn't even compute what she was looking at. But then, when it clicked, she let out a scream. Because underneath the coffee table was Jack. He was lying face down on the carpet with a pool of blood under his head. Carol rushed over to Jack and shook him, but he didn't move or make a sound. And so in a panic, she found her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, Carol shouted that there'd been some kind of horrible accident. Her fiancé must have fallen and hit his head on the coffee table, and she begged the dispatcher to please send help now. Moments later, police and first responders arrived, and they had to physically drag Carol away from Jack's side. Carol watched as they knelt beside her fiancé and checked for a pulse, but they didn't find one. Carol's world crumbled. She knew Jack was dead. A short while later, Detective Lori McKeel of the Allegheny County Homicide Unit arrived on the scene. A perimeter was already established, and the house was crawling with police. But before McKeel went in, she looked around outside. Neighbors were watching the activity from their front lawns, and McKeel noticed a specific group of people huddled together on the sidewalk, consoling a sobbing woman whose hands were covered in blood. McKeel guessed this must be the victim's partner, and the people around her were her family. But before speaking to her, the detective quickly made her way across the yard and went inside of the house. Inside, officers and forensic techs searched the front room for evidence. McKeel had already been briefed on this case, so she knew the victim's name was Jack Parks, and his fiancée had found him dead after an apparent fall. McKeel went into the living room, where Jack's body lay face up, partially underneath the coffee table. There was a lot of blood, and at first glance, a fall didn't seem out of the question. However, when she crouched down to get a better look, she found a small hole behind Jack's right ear, toward the back of his skull. It was a gunshot wound, which meant this was no accidental fall. This was a murder. McKeel stood up and told the other investigators nearby to keep their eyes peeled for bullet casings or a gun. Then she continued scanning the house. The house was lived in, but relatively neat, with boxes of what looked like wedding favors stacked in the hall. But when McKeel stepped inside of the master bedroom, she saw this room had been totally ransacked. Dressers were overturned and drawers were pulled out. Several jewelry boxes lay empty and discarded on the carpet. Either this was a robbery, or someone had staged the scene to make it look like one. As McKeel made her way back to the living room, she saw several photos of what looked like a seemingly loving couple about to get married. But McKeel's training told her not to take anything at face value. Every relationship had its problems, and a deadline like a wedding could bring tension to the surface. So before McKeel did anything else, she wanted to speak to Jack's fiancé. If there were any skeletons in the couple's closet, she needed to know about them. Later that afternoon, Detective McKeel sat with Carol in an interview room at the police station. McKeel knew that so far, nobody had told Carol much of anything, including the fact that Jack's death was a murder, not an accidental fall. And from McKeel's point of view, this was a good thing. The romantic partner was always the primary suspect in a murder. And so McKeel wanted to study how Carol behaved in their interview before she told Carol anything about the investigation. So McKeel started slowly, asking basic questions about Carol's relationship with Jack. But as Carol calmed down and opened up, McKeel began to probe deeper. She asked if either Carol or Jack was getting cold feet about their wedding, and why did it take them so long to get engaged? Were there suspicions of infidelity? What about money problems? McKeel watched Carol for any hint of defensiveness or anger. But while Carol did deny having any problems with Jack, she didn't seem mad at being asked about it. She just seemed confused. So, McKeel decided to ask a question that she knew would increase the pressure, by making it obvious that Carol was now a suspect in a murder. The detective looked into Carol's eyes and asked her if she owned a gun. And at this, Carol froze. After a second, she asked why she was being questioned about a gun when her fiancé had fallen. McKeel stayed quiet and watched as Carol's expression changed from confusion to understanding. Carol just looked at McKeel and said, "Are you saying Jack was shot?" And then, Carol just began sobbing. Even though McKeel could not officially rule Carol out as a suspect yet, she did think Carol's reaction to this was very genuine. So McKeel handed Carol a box of tissues and asked in a gentle voice if Jack had any enemies. Through tears, Carol said no. In fact, if anything, Jack was sometimes too friendly. Recently, Carol said she'd come home to find Jack hanging out in the living room with one of the workers from the factory across the street. Carol said she'd been mad at him for letting a stranger inside of their home. And then after that, Carol just broke into more sobs. McKeel narrowed her eyes as she thought back to Jack and Carol's ransacked bedroom. Crime scene techs were still processing the scene, but it had looked like theft was at least part of the motive. So if Jack really had no enemies and his murder was not personal, then this being a robbery by a stranger, like a factory worker, was a definite possibility. McKeel knew that if Jack and Carol's home really had been robbed during this murder, then whoever did the robbery would likely try to unload the stolen goods quickly. And the easiest way to do that was to sell them to a local pawn shop. So, the day after Jack's murder, McKeel got a list of the items missing from Jack and Carol's home, which included several expensive watches, rings, and other pieces of jewelry, and contacted every pawn shop in the immediate area. But none of them claimed to have any of the missing jewelry yet, so McKeel left descriptions of the items along with her number. McKeel also contacted the City of Pittsburgh Pawn Division, which kept an extensive database of pawned items, and gave them descriptions of the stolen jewelry as well. It was sort of like she was fishing, and so McKeel knew she had to be patient. So, while she waited to hear back, she began looking into the workers from the Silver Star Meats Factory. Within a few days of the murder, McKeel led a team of officers to that factory. And as soon as she stepped out of her car, she could see that anybody standing right outside of the factory would have a clear view of Jack and Carol's front door and garage. From speaking to Carol, she knew Jack had been friendly with several factory employees, and on at least one occasion had invited them into his home. And so those types of visits would have been perfect opportunities to learn the layout of Jack and Carol's house and to figure out where they kept their valuables. Once inside the factory, McKeel and her officers began interviewing close to 40 workers, one by one. And pretty quickly, they identified the man who'd been invited by Jack into their home. His name was Ronald Blevins, and he had a criminal history of petty theft and assault. To McKeel, this was promising. But Blevins had not been at work on the day of Jack's murder because he was on a scheduled vacation. Now, McKeel did not think this made him any less of a suspect, but this early in the case, there wasn't any physical evidence to connect him to the crime, so she couldn't arrest him. As McKeel and her team left the meat factory, she felt a bit deflated. She really needed the forensics to come back if she was going to make any real progress on this case. Fortunately, though, there would be new evidence for her waiting back at the station. A copy of Jack's autopsy report was sitting on McKeel's desk. She opened it and began reading. And right away, she saw something important. Other than the gunshot wound, there were no bruises or scratches found anywhere on Jack's body. There was no sign of a struggle at all. And so McKeel knew this could mean that the killer broke into the house and then surprised Jack and shot him from behind, or it could mean Jack knew his killer and had let this person inside of his house. McKeel kept on reading the report, and as she got towards the end of it, her eyes went wide. The coroner had made a major discovery. A bullet had been extracted from Jack's skull, and they determined it came from a .380 caliber handgun. This was extremely helpful. McKeel still did not have the actual murder weapon, but now she knew what kind of gun she was looking for. And so she wanted to find out if somebody close to Jack, someone let's say he would have welcomed into his home, owned a gun like that. Over the next few days, Detective McKeel interviewed Jack's friends and family, and most of them echoed Carol's comments that Jack got along with everybody. And no one McKeel met with claimed to own a .380 caliber handgun. And so McKeel felt like she was quickly running into yet another dead end. That was until a few people mentioned a fight Jack had had with Carol's nephew at a Labor Day party. And also folks mentioned that one of Jack's nephews, so a different nephew, was looking to hash out a serious and urgent matter with his uncle in the days right before the murder. The people who mentioned those two nephews said that the nephews had been really close with Jack for most of their lives. But McKeel knew those relationships could have turned bad as soon as jewelry or money got involved. So she went to interview both men immediately. The first house she went to belonged to Carol's nephew, Michael LaPaya, the Army veteran who Jack and Carol had accused of stealing at their Labor Day party. When she began questioning Michael, he didn't deny that he and his uncle had a falling out. But he also insisted Jack was wrong about him stealing. More importantly, though, Michael denied having anything to do with Jack's death. He said he'd been busy on the day of the murder, at a doctor's appointment to treat his PTSD, and then he had also gone shopping with his girlfriend. And he showed McKeel receipts to prove it. And also, Michael did admit that he had lots of guns, and he knew how to use them after his time in the military. However, the one gun he didn't own was a .380 caliber handgun. After the interview, McKeel contacted the Veterans Affairs Medical Center and confirmed that Michael attended his appointment on the day of the murder. She was also able to verify that charges had been made on his credit card in a different city around the time of Jack's death. All in all, Michael's alibi seemed solid. So, Detective McKeel headed back to Jack and Carol's neighborhood to meet with the second nephew that Jack's friends and family had mentioned. This was Jack's nephew, Bradley, the one who lived on the same street and had been apparently wanting to speak with Jack in person about something serious and urgent. Now, from what other people had already told her, McKeel knew Bradley was mad at Jack for selling his mother's house, because Bradley thought the property should stay in the family. She also knew Bradley and Carol didn't really get along. To McKeel, this sounded like a pretty deep-rooted dispute, and she expected Bradley to be cagey when they spoke about it. However, once they sat down at Bradley's kitchen table, what Bradley actually said blew McKeel away. Right off the bat, Bradley said that at 10:30 a.m. on July 21st, which was the day of the murder, he'd waited until Carol had left for work and then walked over to Jack's house to confront him. Bradley said once Jack let him inside, he'd immediately asked Jack to halt the sale of his grandmother's house. Bradley was struggling financially and wanted to move into his grandmother's house with his girlfriend to save money. Bradley said Jack seemed open to the idea, but he refused to make a decision right then because he wanted to speak to Carol first. And at that point, Bradley knew he was not going to get the house, because he knew Carol would not like the idea and she would convince Jack to keep trying to sell the house. So Bradley told McKeel he'd just given up and left Jack's house sometime around 11:15 a.m., a little more than 3 hours before Carol would arrive home and find Jack dead. As Bradley finished up the story, McKeel was stunned silent. Bradley had just openly confessed to being inside of Jack's home alone with him on the day Jack died. And also, Bradley admitted that he had been there arguing over a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But amazingly, Bradley still wasn't done with his story. Just as McKeel was about to leave, he casually revealed one more fact. He told her that he did in fact own a .380 caliber handgun. McKeel confiscated Bradley's gun, then raced back to the station to have it analyzed by the ballistics lab to see if it was the murder weapon. It would take a while for the results to come in, but McKeel barely had to wait before she got another huge break in the case. That day, a member of McKeel's team told her he'd finally received a call back from a pawn shop owner in a nearby town. According to that owner, a young couple had come into their shop on July 21st, the day of Jack's murder. And this couple had wanted to sell a bunch of jewelry, including gold chains and rings. And the owner noticed that several of these pieces had been smashed and mangled, which made the owner suspect that these could be stolen. And so as a result, he had not purchased these pieces of jewelry, but he'd convinced the couple to let him take a few photos of the jewelry, and then after the couple left, he contacted the police in the area. And it had taken 3 days for those police to connect the incident to Jack's case and then get in touch with McKeel's team. But as soon as McKeel got this news, she went straight to the pawn shop to review the photos of the potentially stolen items. And when she saw these photos, there was no doubt that was Jack's jewelry. Now, this pawn shop did not have a security camera, so there was no footage of the couple who tried to sell Jack's stuff. But McKeel showed the pawn shop owner some photos of local criminals along with dozens of people of interest in Jack's murder case, which included Jack's nephew Bradley. And as these pictures were being shown, the owner suddenly stopped McKeel and pointed out one person in particular and said, "Yep, that's the man I saw." And to McKeel's surprise, it was not Bradley. The man the pawn shop owner picked out was named Brian Gibbons. He had a record of theft, and the police knew of him, but they hadn't remotely considered him as a suspect in Jack's murder because Brian had no known connections to Jack. But now, armed with this new information, McKeel left the pawn shop and headed to Brian's house. And as soon as Brian saw her, McKeel could tell she'd taken him by surprise. Brian denied having any knowledge of the murder, but when McKeel looked in his bedroom, It was absolutely littered with purses and jewelry. None of the items belonged to Jack or Carol, but a lot of the stuff had been reported stolen. This meant McKeel could charge Brian and hold him in custody while she looked for a connection to Jack's case. And so that's what McKeel did. She arrested Brian for theft. However, she still wasn't totally sure if he'd actually played a role in Jack's murder. McKeel had basically convinced herself that Jack's nephew, Bradley, was the killer. But now, Brian had come out of left field, and he seemed like an equally strong suspect. And so McKeel wondered if maybe these two men had worked together, with Bradley actually committing the crime and then passing off the jewelry to Brian to sell. But McKeel had no evidence that these two men even knew each other. And until the ballistics results came back, she didn't even know if Bradley's gun was the murder weapon. It was like suddenly McKeel had gone from having a case full of dead ends to having a case with too many good suspects. It would take another week before the final piece of evidence fell into place. On August 4th, 2 weeks after Jack's death, McKeel got a call about a second pawn shop, where a young man had stopped in the day after the murder trying to sell a bunch of damaged jewelry. Unlike at the first pawn shop, the employee at this one had not realized the jewelry was stolen, so he had bought it. Police had already examined the jewelry and confirmed it belonged to Jack. But the most important thing about this pawn shop was that it did have a security camera. And when McKeel watched that footage, she knew who killed Jack. Based on that surveillance footage, evidence collected at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Jack Parks on the morning of July 21st, 2014. That morning, the killer woke up in agony. They lay in bed for several minutes, drenched in sweat. Their cramps were getting worse. And beneath the pain, a horrible, clawing hunger was growing, demanding to be fed. From the next room, their partner shouted that they were heading off to work. At this, the killer scrambled up, yelling for their partner to wait. The killer dragged themselves out of bed and stumbled from the room. With a wild look on their face, they told their partner to call in sick today. They were going for a ride. A short while later, at about noon, the couple pulled up to the curb 1 block from the Silver Star Meats factory. The killer eyed the house directly across from the factory. The garage was open, and Jack's car was inside. He was home. The killer reached inside the glove box and took out a .380 caliber handgun. They told their partner to drive away if they weren't back in 30 minutes. Then they pocketed the gun, pulled the hood of their sweatshirt over their head, and got out of the car. The killer's heart pounded as they hurried down the sidewalk, avoiding eye contact with the meat factory employees, just standing about in their blood-stained aprons. The killer reached Jack's house, headed up the walkway, went through the front gate, and right to the door. They knocked and then waited. When no one answered, they urgently knocked again. The door opened. Jack looked out and quickly waved the killer inside. Jack turned away from the door and asked the killer if he could get them something to drink. But the killer didn't answer. Instead, they followed Jack through the doorway and into the front room, and there, they stopped, drew the gun from their pocket, raised the barrel just inches from Jack's right ear, and fired. The bullet struck Jack in the back of the head. He fell, dead before he even touched the ground. And immediately, the killer bolted upstairs to the master bedroom, where they tore through the dresser, ripping out drawers and dumping the contents all over the floor. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. They quickly dug through the room and found Carol's jewelry box and Jack's rings, chains, and watches. The killer stuck the items into the pockets of their sweatshirt, feeling a thrill of victory. Soon, that gnawing hunger would be satisfied. The pain would end. Then, the phone in the house began to ring, and the killer just froze. The killer listened as the call went to voicemail. Carol's voice echoed from the machine, asking why Jack wasn't picking up his cell phone, telling him that somebody was interested in buying his mother's house, and they needed to get there by 4 p.m. to open it up. Then Carol said she loved him and hung up. As soon as the voicemail ended, the killer rushed back downstairs to the front door. They grabbed the key off an end table to lock the deadbolt, but then something caught their eye. And once again, they froze. The killer saw Jack's feet jutting out from behind the coffee table. Beyond that, the killer saw the whole living room. It was a place with a lot of happy memories, where they, the killer, had spent countless slumber parties eating popcorn and watching movies with their cousins. A lump began to form in the killer's throat as they looked at a particular photo on the wall. Their 10-year-old self was smiling right back at them. The killer looked down at the floor, said goodbye to their Uncle Jack, and left. Jack's nephew, Bradley Johnson, had been high on Detective McKeel's suspect list. But when the results of the ballistics test on Bradley's .380 caliber handgun came back, it did not match the murder weapon. Also, at that second pawn shop where they had surveillance footage, it was not Bradley who McKeel saw, because Bradley didn't kill his uncle. Carol's nephew, the disgraced Army veteran Michael LaPaya, did. It would turn out Michael had been really struggling since his dishonorable discharge from the Army, even worse than some of his family knew. He'd started using heroin and begun stealing to support the habit. And as his addiction worsened, Michael became increasingly desperate for cash. And in July 2014, he saw a quick way to get it, by killing Uncle Jack and stealing his jewelry. Jewelry Michael pawned the next day for just a little over $1,000. Once Detective McKeel saw Michael on that pawn shop surveillance footage, she was sure she'd found Jack's killer. And soon after that, she dug into Michael's phone records and discovered that his phone had pinged off a cell phone tower near Jack's house around the time of the murder, not long before Michael had gone shopping with his girlfriend and to his medical appointment just to give himself an alibi. Eventually, Michael would confess to what he'd done. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His girlfriend and alleged getaway driver was never charged. As for Brian Gibbons, the jewelry thief who Detective McKeel thought could be connected to this case, he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. The pawnshop owner who identified him had simply made a mistake. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the US Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest two-story home located just a couple of minutes drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs with all these cookie-cutter two-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike. Or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage, she goes to the other side of the house and she gets her husband, she brings James back and he looks inside. He's just as shocked as she is. And the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror and she was applying eyeliner and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons, but again, there's silence. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway, and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet, and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her, and she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway, or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs. She did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her. She was sure of it. And so she went back to her room thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, you're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it. But this really upset Brittany and she got mad at James. And before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, they weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily. And then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert. And instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs. Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying, and Brittany's picking up on this. And so finally she just says, James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed? And so James is like, yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house. But Brittany was not convinced. And she says, you know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house. And so Brittany would get out of her bed. She'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway. And as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. And so very slowly, she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything's fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James, the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, you are totally overreacting, you're being paranoid, you're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house. And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, you stay right here. And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep. And at this, Brittany is incredulous. And she says to her husband, you gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening. And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is probably just another ad for cheap cigarettes for my pet dolphin. But no, it's not. Don't worry. This ad is for all my good, honest, hardworking people that just want to kick back and relax and purchase a high-quality rabid turtle to send to the like button without being interrupted by disgusting pesky pop-up ads. If you're living this pop-up nightmare right now, then today is your lucky day because NordVPN exists. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN ensure that all your data remains behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature, Threat Protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting pop-up ads that have been destroying your opportunity to buy a quality rab turret. NordVPN's Threat Protection will also protect you from malicious sites, trackers, and downloads. So, you can either go waste your money on any of the hundreds of so-called deals out there for cheap dolphin cigarettes, as if that exists, or you can be a big dog, sign up for NordVPN, and buy an infinite number of quality rab turrets without interruption. Talk about a no-brainer. Currently, the best deal for NordVPN is through my YouTube offer. Right now, NordVPN is offering viewers an exclusive 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus an additional month free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing. And then after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. And it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside, and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in, he opens it up, there's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music, they came over, and they noticed that maybe I saw them, and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, we got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, no, we haven't touched it. She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally, they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay, but the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, James, were you riding your bike before we left? And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him, the kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, we've been robbed. And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, you stay in the car, do not get out. And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces, there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place. And he knew that was not his family's. minutes, someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room, their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so after James and Brittany see this, they realize that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then suddenly a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James,
"This is not your house."
and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy, whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man, he would just stand on the Campbell's property, staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up, and Ezekiel would not put up any fight. He would be arrested, and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house, and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs, and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out, months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second floor bathroom. And then whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's Omnivore Trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbell's decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death. Allegedly, although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family, or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called Omnivore Trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown.